From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
For decades, astronomers and scientists alike have attempted to find evidence of alien life. They've sent golden records deep into space aboard probes. They've used massive satellite dishes designed to listen for radio signals from space. They've used highly sensitive telescopes to look for any evidence that we are not alone in the cosmos. But what if some alien species has already taken notice of us? And not only that, but has sent a probe to check us out. This week's guest is Dr. Avi Loeb. Dr. Loeb is the Frank B. Baird Jr. Professor of Science at Harvard University and a best-selling author. He received his PhD in physics from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel at age 24, led the first international project supported by the Strategic Defense Initiative, and was subsequently a long-term member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. He's written 8 books, including the recent Extraterrestrial, and over 800 papers on a wide range of topics, including black holes, the first stars, the search for extraterrestrial life, and the future of the universe. In 2017, Dr. Loeb rocked the scientific community when he co-wrote a paper that argued that a mysterious object nicknamed Oumuamua, spotted by astronomers passing through our solar system, was in fact a probe sent here by an alien civilization. We talk all about why he feels so strongly that this mysterious object was no naturally occurring phenomenon on this week's episode. Extraterrestrial, the Mystery of Oumuamua. Welcome to From the Void. All right. Welcome, Dr. Avi Loeb. Thank you so much for spending some time tonight with us.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate it. So for folks who aren't familiar with your work, tell people a little bit about your background and what you do.
Well, I'm still the same kid that grew up on a farm. People that know me would tell you that I haven't changed much. And I see science as a privilege of maintaining your childhood curiosity without worrying too much about the way you are perceived. Unfortunately, in academia, that is not very common these days. People worry about their image. But I grew up on a farm, and I was mainly interested in questions in philosophy. And then circumstances brought me to a tenured appointment at Harvard University as a professor of science and mainly focused on astronomy. But I then realized that my arranged marriage is actually to my true love, because in astronomy we can actually address philosophical questions and using the scientific method. And that's pretty much what I'm doing now. I really enjoy it. And some of the fundamental questions that I enjoy addressing are what happened early on in the universe? How was the first light created by the first stars? This is a frontier that I helped pioneer some couple of decades ago, and it's basically the scientific version of the story of Genesis that you find in the first chapter of the Old Testament, the Bible. And then another subject is black holes that I'm very interested in particular imaging them, seeing the silhouette of a black hole, a subject that I worked on for 15 years. And just a couple of years ago, the first image was obtained at the Black Hole Initiative in the conference room of our center that I was the founding director of. So we're very proud of the first image of a black hole to have been obtained at Harvard. And then the most exciting frontier that I'm happy to work on right now is the search for extraterrestrial life. And I just finished 2 books over the past 6 months. One of them is at a popular level, which is called the Extraterrestrial. And it became a bestseller in the US and many other countries. It's translated to 25 languages, 28 editions, and I had about 1,000 interviews about it over the past 6 months. And the second is a textbook, more than 1,000 pages long, to be used by scientists working in this area, and it was just published recently, and that's more for professionals. And both of these address the quest for answering the question, are we alone? Or more importantly, in my mind, is are we the smartest kid in the cosmic block?
Yeah, so I mean, you're obviously involved in a lot of different projects. You mentioned black holes and the origins of the universe. So how did you become interested in the search for extraterrestrial life?
Oh, it was gradual. At first, I had the idea. I was invited to take part in a conference to inaugurate a new campus that New York University established in Abu Dhabi. And so I went there, and then we had a tour through Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and the tour guide was bragging that since it's next to oil fields, then they have so much power there that the city lights of Dubai and Abu Dhabi can be seen all the way from the moon at nighttime. And then I asked a colleague of mine, Ed Turner, who also attended the conference. I said, "Oh, that's interesting. How far away can we see with the Hubble Space Telescope city lights?" So we, instead of listening to all the lecturers at the conference, we were checking, how much light is emitted by Tokyo. And suppose Tokyo existed on Pluto, would we see it with the Hubble Space Telescope? The answer is yes. In a very deep image of the Hubble Space Telescope, you can see a city like Tokyo all the way to the outskirts of the solar system. And then we wrote a paper about it. So how can you tell that you're seeing a city versus an object that just reflects sunlight? Or that you could see a spaceship moving that produces some artificial light. How can you differentiate that from an object like an asteroid or a comet or some rock that is reflecting sunlight? And the answer is very easily, because an object that reflects sunlight dims much more quickly as it recedes away from the sun, because the amount of light that is impinging on its surface gets lower as it moves away. And then on top of that, the increasing distance makes the flux that we receive smaller. And altogether, it dims inversely with distance to the fourth power. And if you have an object producing its own light, then it dims only inversely with distance squared, just like a light bulb. As you move away from a light bulb. So we wrote a paper saying you can tell the difference. And when I asked an astronomer that his name is Mike Brown from Caltech, that worked for many years on, he actually discovered many of the most distant objects in the solar system in the so-called the Kuiper belt. I asked him, did you ever check whether any of these objects gets dimmer inversely with distance to the fourth power or distance squared? He said, why should I check? It must be inversely with distance to the fourth power. It must be a reflection of sunlight. So here, in a nutshell, is why astronomers do not discover new things, because they assume they know the answer in advance. And we will get back to this theme later on. But that was my first encounter with a forecast for a technological signature. Of course, before that, I had a paper just arguing that radio telescopes that we developed for the purpose of imaging hydrogen in the infant universe can also detect radio waves leaking out of a planet that has, radio or television broadcasts. I see that less of an original idea, just basically saying that we're building for cosmology these new radio telescopes that will be extremely sensitive. They can also be used for eavesdropping. And that paper I wrote some 7 years earlier. But and I remember actually that one of the leaders in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence visited the Center for Astrophysics and said, even Avi Loeb is working on this subject. He just wrote a paper. So as if that was a completely unexpected thing for me to do, working on cosmology, that I decided. So anyway, after that, in 2015, I came across the idea that you might actually search for industrial pollution, because at that time people talked a lot about climate change, and I said, okay, well, suppose there is industrial pollution in the atmosphere of another planet. Can we see it? And we wrote a paper with an undergraduate student talking about CFCs, these molecules that are produced by refrigerating systems and industries here on Earth. And the idea is that you can search for these things in the atmospheres of other planets that are transiting their star. Instead of searching for oxygen or methane, like the mainstream of astronomy is arguing. And by the way, oxygen didn't really exist in large quantities in the atmosphere, even though there were lots of microbes on Earth for the first 2 billion years. So if you don't find oxygen, it doesn't say that there are no microbes, there is no life. So, but if you find CFCs, it definitely tells you that not only there is life, but industrial life. So I think it's worth motivating some of the future telescopes that the astronomy community is proposing for the cost of, billions of dollars, saying we might actually search for industrial pollution. Again, it's not something that is being embraced by the mainstream, just like looking for city lights is not embraced. And then a couple of years later, 2017, October 19th, there was this first interstellar object, the first object from outside the solar system that was discovered by a telescope in Hawaii called Pan-STARRS. It was given the name Oumuamua. And at first, everyone assumed that it's a rock that came from another star. But then as more data was collected, it didn't look like anything we've seen before. So I just made a proposal that it may be artificial in origin. And of course, that created a huge splash, both in the media and among my colleagues. And I'm still feeling the ripples of that. And I wrote the book on that, Extraterrestrial. So that's the way I got into the business. And it was pretty much a sequence of ideas. And the most recent one was connected to evidence. And so that's how I got. And of course, just recently, a couple of weeks ago, there was this report that was delivered to Congress talking about some unusual objects here on Earth that the government is unable to identify and doesn't know the nature of. And serious people, in the government are talking about it as real. People like former presidents Clinton and Obama, former CIA directors like Brennan and Woolsey. These are highly respectable people. And, the government is the most conservative organization that you can imagine, because people are worried in politics. People are worried about their image a lot, because image buys you political power. And how is it possible that the government talks about something like that, which was stigma and taboo in the past, whereas the scientific community, which is supposed to be occupied with blue sky thinking, open-minded thinking, is ridiculing this and saying, don't even think about it, don't dare to talk about it, and business as usual. So how is that possible? How did we come to this point?
Yeah, that is one of the questions that I have. It seems that so much of, quote, mainstream science is so reluctant to even touch this subject. And yet, we have programs like SETI, for example. You mentioned radio waves. We've been listening to the skies that program's been around for a while, and yet we don't really have any evidence, through this program. So why wouldn't we, consider some of the ideas that you have?
So I'll tell you my experience, which is quite remarkable, because I'm a theoretical astrophysicist. Okay, so that means I make a living out of ideas. Okay, and actually, when I started my career, my mentor at Princeton, John Bacall, said, "What computer programs are you often using?" And I told him, "I don't really use much the computer, and I only use it when I have no other choice, and I only use it to the extent that I really need it." And he said, "How can you get a PhD with such an approach?" He was joking. And in fact, I had a career based on the fact that people come to my office, tell me about, what they're doing. And within a few seconds, I come up with a question saying, "Did you check this or that?" And they tell me, "Wow, that's a great insight." And in fact, they work on it for months afterwards. And that, for some of them, it defines their career. So I just don't understand why they didn't think about it in advance. But at any event, that's the way I make my living. But so I'm a theoretical astrophysicist. And, I've written by now more than 800 papers and so forth. And then, as a result of my book and as a result of the Pentagon report to Congress, I participated in a lot of interviews and podcasts and so forth. So my name is quite visible now. And suddenly, like a few weeks ago, I get an email from the administrators saying at Harvard, saying, okay, there is this fund of a certain amount of money, hundreds of thousands, that you can use for your research. And I say, what do you mean there is this fund? This never happens. Like, who is the person that gave this money? I want to thank that person. Isn't it And then, it took a while for them to get back to me. And I said, look, this is an elementary thing to do, to thank someone who gives you money, right? I mean, I've never met that person. I don't know who that person is. And I want to thank that person because he gave me money. So at the end, I was given the information, of who that person is. I established a Zoom meeting with that person and thanked him. And by now, there are, 4 wealthy individuals that decided to give me or give my research group funds to explore the nature of unidentified objects, including objects like Oumuamua, this object that was found in 2017 that may be a technological relic from another civilization. And, it's an observational search. It's basically getting new data and analyzing it. So even though I'm a theoretical astrophysicist, I'm now trying to establish a research group that will collect the data, because if I don't do it, other people apparently won't do it. And, you don't go to a plumber and ask the plumber to bake you a cake, right? That's something you never do. And so going to the government, to politicians, national security advisors, or military personnel, and asking them to explain to us what they're seeing in the sky is inappropriate. It's just like asking a plumber to bake you a cake, because they were not trained as scientists. So first of all, the data was not collected with the best instruments. The camera was jittering in the airplane, in the fighter jet that was used by the pilots, and the pilots are not scientists, and so why would we expect them to figure out what the nature of these objects is, and it should be the task of scientists. So this subject should move away from the talking points of politicians, military personnel, to be in the realm of scientific inquiry. And basically one can deploy telescopes equipped with cameras and feed the data stream into computers that will analyze the data. And that's what I hope to establish. And the reason I can do that is because these wealthy individuals approached me. I didn't do any fundraising. So in a way, it's remarkable, right? Because the private sector is more open-minded than the scientific community. And I should say, even the religious Orthodox community is open-minded, because there was a magazine in New York City of the Jewish Orthodox called Ami, and they decided to feature my book on the cover of their magazine. So a colleague of mine from Harvard University, Stephen Greenblatt, wrote an email to me and said, look, it looks like the Orthodox are more open-minded towards your ideas than your colleagues.
Well, it does really seem as if the private sector is really the future of kind of pushing the advancement of technology forward. I mean, even NASA has now, when they dismantled the shuttle program, have, incentivized and privatized that whole section of their program. And so it does seem like because there's less red tape, that there are people with funds and the means to kind of take, what seems like maybe a wild idea and push it forward, like your Elon Musk and that sort of thing.
Well, it's not just red tape. That's what I'm trying to emphasize. I think it has to do with the intellectual culture that is open to innovation and risk-taking, entrepreneurship in the private sector. And if you think about it, that's quite ridiculous that organizations that are for profit, that's the definition, are more open-minded than non-profit organizations like academia. And moreover, in academia, you have this concept of tenure. What's the purpose of tenure? The purpose is to allow people that are sufficiently accomplished to have job security, irrespective of the risks they take in their research. That's the purpose. Now, what do you find instead? That once people get tenure, they become even more cautious. They don't take risks because they want to improve their image, never make mistakes, get honors and awards. And that misses the point, And how is it possible that you have blue sky research in private companies at the level that supersedes academia? And it has to do with the intellectual culture, with the willingness to take risks. And if you never take risks, if you never put some skin in the game, you never make discoveries. And even Albert Einstein, in the last decade of his career, made 3 mistakes. He argued that black holes do not exist, gravitational waves do not exist, and quantum mechanics doesn't have spooky action at a distance. And the moral of the story is that you have to allow yourself to make mistakes. That's what kids do. That's why I'm saying science is supposed to be driven by childhood curiosity. You shouldn't be afraid of bumping into things, making mistakes, getting some bruises, because that's the way to learn new things that you've never anticipated. And the attention should be really on anomalies, things that do not match what you expected. So if you see an object like Oumuamua that doesn't look like a comet or an asteroid that you have seen many times before, that should be an exciting occasion. That should be an opportunity to learn something new, because even if it's natural in origin, it represents a birthplace, a nursery that makes such objects that we've never witnessed before, because it doesn't look like objects in the solar system. So that should be exciting. But instead, when there was a colloquium about Oumuamua at Harvard, and I left the auditorium with a colleague of mine, he said, Oumuamua is so strange, I wish it never existed. So to the mainstream, actually, when you see something anomalous, it's a threat. It puts them in discomfort. And that should not be the case. It should be an exciting occasion. Let's figure out what this thing is, rather than be attached to our ego and claim that we knew the answer before it appeared.
Absolutely. And so that's a great transition into Oumuamua, which, by the way, is Hawaiian for scout, I believe. Is that correct?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So describe for people exactly what this is and why this was such an unusual discovery.
Well, it was the first object that we identified from outside the solar system in the vicinity of Earth. And we detected it just because it reflected sunlight, the size of a football field. And at first people thought it must be a comet. But comets are rocks covered with ice. So when they get close to the sun, the ice evaporates and you see a cometary tail of gas and dust. And there was no cometary tail around this object. And in fact, the Spitzer Space Telescope looked very deeply and couldn't find any traces of carbon-based molecules. So it was definitely not a comet of the type that we have seen before. And then people said, okay, well, maybe it's just bare rock. It's an asteroid from another star. The problem with that is, first of all, as it was tumbling, the amount of sunlight reflected changed by a factor of 10. So that meant that it has a very extreme shape. And the best fit to the variation in reflected sunlight was that of a flat object, pancake-shaped. And then it showed and exhibited an excess push away from the sun. And the only way I could interpret that, given that it had no evaporation that gives it the rocket effect, the only way I could think of explaining that is by the reflection of sunlight from its surface. And for that, it had to be very thin, sort of like a sail. And so I said, nature doesn't make very thin object like that. So it might be artificial in origin. And then in September 2020, there was another object discovered that also exhibited an excess push by reflecting sunlight and didn't have a cometary tail. And turns out that it was given the name 2020 SO. And the astronomers that discovered it with the same telescope, Pan-STARRS in Hawaii, they realized that it came actually from Earth. It was a rocket booster launched in 1966 towards the moon. And therefore, it had the thin walls, and that's why the reflection of sunlight gave it a push. it had a large area for its weight. And also, we know that we produced it, so it's artificial in origin. The question is, who produced Oumuamua?
That is the question, right? So a lot of people just kind of pass it off, it seems like, as, an asteroid or nothing, significant. But, as you said, the other thing that I think I read was that if it had been a comet, we would also expect that over time it would shrink in size as the ice melted around it. And that wasn't happening as well, correct?
Yeah. So in fact, in order to get the push that it exhibited, it had to lose about a tenth of its mass, 10%. And first, we would see that clearly as a cometary tail. But second, it would change the way that the object moved in a way that we would notice. And moreover, there is a certain distance from the sun where ice doesn't evaporate. So this excess push should have had a cutoff beyond a certain distance. We didn't see that. The push declined inversely with distance squared, as you expect for reflected sunlight. And it didn't have a sharp cutoff, as you expect for evaporating ice. And all of this argue that it's something that we've never seen before. And, there were a number of people, four teams that suggested alternative explanations for the weird properties of Oumuamua, which are summarized in my book, and there are more that I didn't mention. And they came up with objects that we've never seen before, like a hydrogen iceberg, a nitrogen iceberg, a cloud of dust particles 100 times less dense than air, things like that. We've never seen it. So if we are entertaining things that we've never seen, why not consider also the possibility that it's an artificial object?
So if it is an artificial object, what do you propose that it might be?
Right. So originally I just said maybe it's a light sail, a very thin film of material that is being pushed by light. But in fact, after the Pentagon report came out, I started thinking, maybe if there are probes here on Earth that were sprinkled on Earth a long time ago, maybe this object was just a receiver, a dish that was collecting information from them. And it was tumbling every 8 hours simply because it looked in all directions. And so it was thin, but for a different purpose, just like this rocket booster that we found in September 2020 that we launched, but was not a light sail. It was just thin, but for a different purpose. So maybe there is a different purpose for which Oumuamua was constructed, but we will never know about these particular objects. However, if we collect more data on similar objects, then we might figure out their nature and their purpose. And the way to get more data, it's not a philosophical question, like many people argue about it as if it, there was even recently there was an article in Nature Astronomy trying to rule out the possibility that Oumuamua was artificial based on philosophical arguments, which I find strange. So, there used to be philosophers during the days of Galileo that refused to look through his telescope because they knew the answer, that the sun moves around the Earth. So are we back to those days where philosophers would make arguments for why they know the answer without dealing with more evidence? But at any event, my point is, it's not a matter of philosophers deciding, and I don't care much about what philosophical arguments say. All I care about is getting a high-resolution photograph. So you send a camera on a spacecraft that will intercept the object, the trajectory of an object like that, just like OSIRIS-REx landed on the asteroid Bennu, took a close-up photograph, and took a sample that it will bring back to Earth in 2023. So, you just get close to an object, take a photograph, and they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. In my case, a picture is worth 66,000 words, the number of words in my book. I wouldn't need to write the book if I had a photograph. I would just show the photograph to people, and that's it, and not even say anything.
But it sounds like we missed our opportunity, though, right? By the time we realized what we were potentially dealing with, it had gone too far to even, kind of intercept or get a good look at.
Yeah, but there should be many more objects that we will find in the future, because we just looked for a few years with pan-stars surveying the sky. And that means if we look for another few years, we will find another one. Or if we look with the Vera Rubin Observatory that will become operational in 2 years, it will be much more sensitive, and we could find one every month. So let's just keep looking. The worst we can do is listening to the mainstream scientists that say, oh, it's nothing, it's natural, don't worry about it, business as usual. And then you don't look, because that's equivalent to closing the curtains on your windows and saying, we don't have neighbors, I'm just the smartest in the entire universe. And if you want to convince me otherwise, just show me extraordinary evidence. But by the way, the curtains are closed, so you can't really see through them whether they're... So, of course, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy if you don't invest any funds in the search. But as I said before, I'm funded, I'm getting funded, so I don't care. I mean, and it's not coming from selection committees populated by my colleagues in academia. It's coming from the private sector. Guess what? There are people that are more imaginative than that and are willing me to open the to allow me to open the curtains. Obviously, if you adopt the view that, you need extraordinary evidence, but you will never look through the windows, obviously, you can sit at home for a while, but eventually you'll hear a knock on the door. And then when you open the door, you do see some extraordinary evidence. But it's a bit late at that point, because you didn't realize the reality that you live in. It would remind me of my daughters when they were small. At home, they thought that they're the smartest in the world, and then they had a psychological shock when we brought them to the kindergarten. On the first day, they hated the kindergarten because they met other kids that are smarter than they are. And obviously, they would have preferred to stay at home and maintain their illusion. But I think science is about breaking illusions. It's about figuring out what the reality is like. And I just find it surprising to see the mainstream in science arguing in favor of maintaining our ignorance.
One of the things that seems to be helping to kind of break this illusion, as you called it, is, as you mentioned, referenced earlier, we have these Pentagon documents that have been released along with video footage of U.S. Navy pilots capturing, these objects that are unexplained, that are moving at speeds that we can't replicate, at least with anything that we're aware of, any technology that we're aware of currently. And it seems like a lot of scientists are kind of having to take a step back and say, okay, well, maybe there is something here. What is your take on kind of the things that we've seen so far and what it might be?
Well, I think what we are seeing is just the tip of the iceberg, because the government has much more data that is classified. And the reason it's classified is not because the data itself has information that should be classified. It's because the data was taken by instruments that if the data were released, people will figure out, in other countries, our adversaries will figure out what kind of instruments we are using to monitor our sky. And that would be a national security compromise. Other countries will know what we are using to monitor, to defend the US. And so as a result of that, the data is not released. But people that have seen some of the classified data are talking about it seriously. And that's why I'm saying that, scientists should take it seriously. And I think the most important statement made in the report, other than the fact that, there must be many more incidents than the ones reported, because there was a stigma on this subject, there was a taboo on discussing it, people were afraid to speak out. But putting that aside, the most important statement was that some of the objects must be real because they were detected by multiple instruments, infrared sensors, radar systems, optical cameras, and many people seeing the same thing, doing the same thing at the same time. So it can't be the malfunction of one instrument. It can't be illusions of one person. So that's why, and I'm sure that there is even more evidence that it's real, that the government just cannot release. So my point is, most of the sky is not classified. That's as an astronomer, I know that we're looking at the sky. Nobody tells us don't look. At least now. Maybe in the days of Galileo, that was the case. Don't look. But so my point is, scientists can just monitor the sky for unusual things, and that's not very expensive, by the way. It's a factor of 10 less expensive than the search for dark matter. It cost us hundreds of millions of dollars so far. We don't know what most of the matter in the universe is, so we labeled it dark matter. And it's made of particles whose identity is not known. So we're searching in the dark because this matter is not coupled to light. It doesn't create light. It doesn't reflect light, so we can't see it. So we call it dark matter. And we don't know what it is. So like 40 years ago, the most popular view was maybe it's weakly interacting massive particles. I remember that in the 80s, that was a dominant idea. And when I started doing astrophysics, that was the prevailing approach. People said the dark matter is made of weakly interacting massive particles. And then a lot of experiments were funded. We were searching for that. And the only thing we came up with as a result of this investment of funds was to set limits and rule out actually the entire parameter space that was considered natural back in the 1980s. And actually in a conference that I organized locally at Harvard just 5 years ago, I asked an experimentalist that gave a lecture about the search for weakly interacting massive particles. I said, how long will you continue to put limits on this type of particle? After all, you've dedicated decades and found nothing. And he said, as long as I'm funded, I will continue, even if it takes my entire career. So just think about it. Hundreds of millions of dollars, didn't find anything. Of course, it's a search in the dark. It's part of the mainstream. And it's legitimate to do that. But why should we invest 1,000 times less in the search for technological relics near Earth? Why should that be so much less funded? And especially when the government comes up with a report about some unidentified objects, why should that be ridiculed and ignored, business as usual, and not even paid attention to when the search for dark matter is funded so much better? And to me, science should reflect the interests of society, because if we find extraterrestrial technology, it would have dramatic implications for us. We would realize that there might be a smarter kid on the block. We would perhaps learn about technologies that represent our future. It will revise our notions about what we might have in the future. It will change our religious and philosophical beliefs about our place in the universe. It will change our relations with each other because we will all be part of the human species. There is something else out there. And all of that is so much more significant than realizing that the dark matter is made of weakly interacting massive particles. What effect would that have on our daily routines? It will just be an anecdote, just, a matter of curiosity. The dark matter doesn't really have a direct impact on our daily lives. Of course, it's important for how the, structure in the universe developed and so forth, understanding where we came from and so forth. But compare that to finding evidence for other technological civilizations. I mean, it just strikes me as a missed opportunity, if I had to say more bluntly, that the scientific community just doesn't recognize. And in fact, it could bring much more funds to science if we were to pay attention to this subject. And it would bring many more kids to science, because suddenly science will become exciting. It will not be a matter of people in wearing ties and thinking very highly of themselves. It's something that everyone can understand, and it doesn't require very sophisticated equations, and you can actually understand. And maybe it will involve artificial intelligence to figure out what their computers are doing. If they sent out systems with artificial intelligence, we need our own artificial intelligence systems to interpret what their systems are doing. Just like asking our kids to tell us what we find on the internet, what does it mean? Because they're much more computer skilled than we are. And so I think it's just the next frontier that would be extremely exciting, and we have the capacity to explore it. So why not do it? And why is it so abundant? That's not clear to me.
Yeah, and it does seem that sort of like the private funding that you're seeing, coming in as a result, it does seem that the advancement in technology when it comes to just basic cameras, it seems like things that we see in the sky will get a lot harder to ignore, I guess, because, there's people who are walking around with 4K cameras in their pockets.
Right.
And they're paying attention and they're getting video evidence and photographic evidence. And it seems like that will just become more and more overwhelming until it's, we can't ignore it any longer.
Yeah, one thing to recognize about cell phone cameras is that the aperture is just a few millimeters in size. And as a result, you will always have a fuzzy image. If you see a human-sized object at a distance of a mile, it would be fuzzy. In order to get a high-resolution image so that, you can figure out what the object is and maybe read off the label, made in nation so-and-so rather than made on planet X. In order to do that, you need a telescope with an aperture of 10 centimeters to a meter, And by the way, I checked online the other day and I saw that, if you just Google 1 meter telescope, you get to a website that says $500,000 add to the bag. You can click on add to the bag, just like you do on buying a toothbrush or something.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know. There must be people that have the money to just add it to their bag.
So what you're saying is we need to make these more affordable so the average person can get a hold of one.
If a project like the one I'm trying to lead will need 100 of those, I'm sure the price will go down significantly. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you coming on. This is absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure we could talk for another hour about black holes and all the things that we've learned since even when I was a kid, during the 80s. But really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for spending some time with us tonight.
Thanks for hosting me. I had a wonderful time.
Is Oumuamua really an alien probe sent here by some advanced civilization? Or is it some sort of naturally occurring phenomenon that we're just now encountering for the first time? If it's not some sort of probe, then why doesn't it have a tail like a comet? And why is it moving at such an unusual speed compared to other rocks hurtling through space? And why, if scientists are right, is it the shape of either a cigar or possibly a pancake? Conveniently, I might add, the very shape reported by UFO witnesses. Unfortunately, we may never know, since we missed our window to view the object more clearly with our current technology. But as telescopes and technology advance, maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to look out into the darkness of space and see one of our distant neighbors headed our way. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. If you enjoy the podcast, please consider telling a friend and leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. I'll be back next week with a brand new mystery, and until then, thanks for listening to From the Void.